The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Thursday night, the first real Republican debate. How else to describe it other than a cesspool of incompetence, bigotry, nonsense, and completely debunked, failed economic ideas. It started like a sporting event, indistinguishable from a parody of a Republican primary from the very start. A total freak show. I'll go through something about each candidate, and then we'll kind of summarize what we saw. Donald Trump at the very beginning would not raise his hand to pledge not to run as a third-party candidate if he does not eventually win the Republican nomination. By all means, please do. The crowd booed. They must realize how disastrous that would be for the Republican Party. And then the crowd just went nuts when Megyn Kelly talked to Donald Trump about calling women fat pigs and insulting Rosie O'Donnell. Even the women were standing up, clapping, the Republican women just loving Donald Trump referring to women as fat pigs. The biggest problem, according to Trump, political correctness. He says we lose to Mexico in trade, but it was Donald Trump himself who was having his menswear line produced in Mexico. It just didn't make any sense. Trump, totally delusional, delusions of grandeur, saying no one was talking about illegal immigration until he brought it up, which is, of course, ridiculous. And I have to tell you, I don't know that his whole rough around the edges, telling it like it is thing really worked that well. I think it sort of backfired a little bit, and he came across as a little belligerent. He did say a couple things I agreed with. He said he was always against going into Iraq. No other Republicans up on that stage were willing to say that. And I agree with Donald Trump that the campaign finance system is a system of legalized bribery, and that he has just used that system to his advantage as best he could by making donations to all sorts of candidates, including many Democrats. So that was Trump getting into it with people, mixing it up. He was already in the lead. I don't know that he helped himself. I think maybe he hurt himself slightly, but I don't know that I expect a really big change in the polls just after this one debate. Ben Carson asked a question towards the beginning, looked completely stunned. I mean, he looked like he was going out to get the paper at 7 a.m. and he just stumbled across a presidential debate with Chris Wallace and Brett Baier and Megyn Kelly asking him questions. He was asked whether he would bring back waterboarding later in the debate. He said that that should really be the government's business and he would not tell anyone if he did. And then lastly, that stood out to me, Ben Carson saying he wants a taxation system based on tithing money to God, just 10%, whether you make $1 billion or $1 million or 100,000 or 10,000, just a 10% flat tax, of course, incredibly regressive, disproportionately hurting people who are just trying to have enough money to afford food. Insane idea. That was Ben Carson. Marco Rubio just made very little splash. He talked a little bit about how Hillary Clinton wouldn't be able to lecture him about living paycheck to paycheck if he is the nominee, because he lived paycheck to paycheck. Otherwise, really did not make much of a splash. I just don't see Marco Rubio having any impact at all on this campaign after this first debate. Jeb Bush, a lot to talk about with Jeb Bush. Jeb Bush said he was proud of George W. Bush. I mean, that should disqualify anybody instantly if you say you're proud of what George W. did as president, whether he's your brother or son or father or whoever. Just absolutely horrifying. He was asked again whether, knowing what we know now, would you go into Iraq? He again didn't really answer. He said, well, the people who died in Iraq didn't die in vain, but maybe they did. They did, right? I mean, why is it a default that anyone who dies in service to their country doesn't die in vain? They might have died because of really bad decisions made by your brother, who might have been president, and then just bumbling and stumbling towards the end of that question. I still don't know the answer. I still don't know whether Jeb Bush would or would not have gone into Iraq, given the what we now know about the reality of that invasion, and then still talking about repealing and replacing Obamacare. Ted Cruz, flaccid, completely flaccid, like a wet noodle, made no impression. He talked about the debt. He tried to do his radical, anti-radical Islam stuff. He talked about jihad. Who could watch and be inspired by Ted Cruz, the one positive. Ted Cruz may have come across as one of the most knowledgeable on foreign policy from the 10 candidates, merely because he knew who al-Sisi was, the president of Egypt. In context, that alone actually did make him stand out a little bit. Chris Christie, not much of a factor. Talked about cutting programs, saying that he is going to look at entitlements. He talked about Social Security a little bit. Not much of an impact for me from Chris Christie at all. Scott Walker did make an impact on me. He was asked about letting a mother die instead of allowing her to have an abortion. His answer was, I'm pro-life. And he says that his view is consistent with that of Americans, but that's not true. 83% of Americans believe there should be exemptions to abortion bans in cases of rape and incest. Scott Walker doesn't believe in that. And then he made it clear he would really like to just be bashing Hillary. He actually said, we should really be talking about Hillary Clinton instead of bickering back and forth. I'm sure that all of the Republicans would love that. It would take the attention away from how foolish they all looked. Then we got to Huckabee. Huckabee was asked, so you're still anti-gay in spite of everything that's been going on. Talk about that. And Mike Huckabee said, we should get even more bold when it comes to social issues like gay marriage and abortion, saying that banning Planned Parenthood isn't enough. Huckabee said a fetus is a person at the zygote stage. A minute after conception, Mike Huckabee says that you are dealing with a person there. Doctors happen to completely disagree with that. And anybody who thinks clearly also disagrees with Huckabee's idea of getting rid of the IRS and passing a consumption tax, a regressive consumption tax, instead of an income tax. Rounding it out was Rand Paul, just lame. Rand Paul getting some applause when he said he's for the Bill of Rights. Okay. Rand Paul did do a good job of mixing it up, and that he went out there and actually argued with some people. He got into it with Donald Trump. He got into it with Chris Christie. So while I didn't hear anything from Rand Paul that really sounded innovative or resonated with me in any way, I think with that mindset we had of with such a divided field, you have to get attention. I think Rand Paul did do a good job just by arguing with people of getting some attention. And then lastly, John Kasich. I don't think Kasich is going to be a factor at all. I think the debate was in Ohio, so the crowd liked Kasich, but I don't know that Kasich is going to be the guy for Republicans. He was one of the most compassionate, though. He talked about rehabbing the drug addicted instead of putting them in prison. Other Republicans, other than Rand Paul, not really into that idea. And also John Kasich saying he not only has a gay friend, but he went to his gay friend's wedding, and if his daughter were a lesbian, he would still love her. So social issues did come up. Jeb Bush saying he did defund Planned Parenthood in Florida. He would continue to defund Planned Parenthood as president. Remember, though, that only 3% of what Planned Parenthood does is abortions. The other 97% is sexual health, disease prevention, preventing pregnancy, which reduces the number of abortions people seek out. On social issues, Marco Rubio going in the direction of abortion, saying that we are barbarians for murdering millions of babies, and clarifying that he never said he even supports an exception to abortion bans for rape and incest. So broad strokes, 15 minutes into the debate, there was not a single substantive policy idea that had been presented. In fact, we needed to get about 45 minutes in to hear anything about policy, and over an hour in until there was really any kind of analysis to be done where we could compare on some policy the position of one candidate versus another. Fox News in the debate a couple of times referred to Hillary Clinton as the sort of presumptive Democratic candidate already. Ben Carson expressed doubts that it would ultimately be Hillary, but Fox News basically taking it as a foregone conclusion. Every single person on the stage would make me disgusted as president. Not just, oh, I don't agree with them on some of their ideas. I'm talking about utter disgust. And, the ideas presented, repealing Obamacare, cutting entitlements, flat taxes, raising the retirement age on Social Security in conjunction with means testing it. The losers in this debate, aside from almost every one of the candidates, are the American people who, instead of having candidates from multiple parties to say, well, here's ideas from this party that I like, and here's a candidate from this party that I think is really sober and with it. No, it was a completely abortive, terrible, embarrassing, world laughing at the U.S. situation. And it's even sadder that half the country almost is going to vote for one of these people that was on this stage, or maybe of the 7 that debated in the second tier debate. If I had to just say something positive, if I ask, well, who was the most presidential looking aside from the absurdities that they said, I think it was probably Jeb Bush, because he didn't really get into it with people. When asked about his criticisms of Donald Trump, calling Trump a buffoon and I don't know what else, he said, I didn't say it, and I don't speak that way, and I don't think we should speak that way. He came out away, I think, looking the most presidential, although he had almost no clue what to even answer on simple questions that he's been asked 100 times, like, knowing what we know now, would you have gone into Iraq? He still couldn't get through that question. So the Republican debate, an embarrassment, and I cannot wait for the next one.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
If you ever shop on Amazon.com, remember that the shopping you do could support the work we do if you first visit our website, davidpakman.com, and click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page. I recommend bookmarking the link and using it whenever you shop. Of course, there is Old Faithful, the David Pakman Show membership program to support the show. Today's new member of the day is Steve Baker. If you would like to join Steve and get access to the bonus show and the commercial-free audio feed and the commercial-free video feed of the show and so many other great things, go to davidpakman.com/membership. 4 years ago this week, we asked if a ban on alcohol sales in bars, restaurants, and liquor stores for 48 hours before a presidential election would affect voter turnout and result. It was a valid question, good food for thought. But why did we feel the need to explore it at all? What would voter turnout look like if we just made voting easier for the American people? Why do we still vote on a Tuesday? Why is it not a national holiday? Many countries in the world vote on a Sunday, some on Saturdays. What if we followed the examples of Switzerland, for example, or Estonia, which have implemented online voting systems? And you would think that the votes would be easier to mess with these systems, but a digital system also is more likely to uncover evidence of tampering and fraud. And I think that on this issue, Americans are too attached to tradition. We know that there's one party that wants it to be more complicated to vote because there's one party that does better when voter turnout is lower, and that is the Republican Party. Or within primaries, the more conservative candidate tends to win when voter turnout is lower. So lots of reasons why the right wants to make voting complex in the interests of democracy, in the interests of really having a representative sample, a bigger sample rather, of our population voting. I think we need to seriously look. I don't know that the national holiday part would make as big of a difference because people might just say, hey, I'm going to travel. If now this is a holiday, I'm not going to vote. But voting on a weekend, I think, does make more sense. And I think an online voting system also makes a lot of sense. You could say, well, Switzerland and Estonia are really small. I don't think that that's a really good reason for why it wouldn't work here in the United States. 3 years ago this week, the NASA Mars rover Curiosity landed safely on Mars. To quote Joe Biden, not on this issue, but talking about something else, it was a big effing deal when the rover landed safely after a 350 million mile journey. The rover, after traveling 350 million miles to Mars, has only traveled about 8.6 kilometers since landing, or about 5.5 miles. By comparison, the Opportunity Mars rover surpassed the 40-kilometer mark. That one landed in 2004. This is all hugely exciting, but maybe it would be more exciting to see a manned mission to Mars. And as we spoke about with Bob Werb earlier this week, Lots of complexities in terms of space travel, radiation. We've talked about the issues of fuel, where at a certain point, the added weight of the fuel you need to carry for long trips starts to actually be a hindrance rather than an asset. It would probably happen more quickly that we could get to Mars with people if we had real global cooperation. And maybe the Mars One project is kind of an example of that, in the sense that anybody can apply, and it's presumably the best people from anywhere in the world that could go there. I believe that we will see, unless my life is going to be a lot shorter than I hope it is, I believe I will see a human on Mars during my lifetime. I don't know for sure that it's going to be 2022 or 2024 or whenever it is that right now is expected to be the arrival date. But unless my life is unexpectedly cut short, I think I will see a human walk on Mars. I don't believe that humans will wipe themselves out before a manned Mars mission happens. But you may disagree. If you are around my age and you don't think that you will see a human walk on Mars, email in. Let me know why you think that. 1 year ago this week, Tim Torgildsen, a blogger and English teacher at Nomen Global Language Center, was fired for writing about homophones because they sounded gay. This is not a joke. This is from a school that was in Utah. Mr. Torgildsen's boss and the school's owner, Clark Woodger, fired him for promoting the gay agenda and said the firing associated the school with homosexuality. Or rather, that the firing was because the teacher was associating the school with homosexuality. He also insulted the teacher by adding that the only job he could handle would be something clerical, where he would be closely supervised and have immediate goals at all times. Homophones are real words, and the blog post in question described what could be one of the trickiest aspects of learning English, right? So if you talk about the words way, and way, right? The three types of way, the way you're going, or curds and whey, etc. That can be very difficult for people learning English as a second language. It has nothing to do with gay people whatsoever, and it really represented a level of paranoia that was reminiscent of Muslim xenophobia in the 9/11 era, or the McCarthy era communist propaganda paranoia. Homophones sound gay, and they associated a school with homosexuality, so Tim Torgildsen had to get fired. I mean, it's just stunning, and it is embarrassing, and they were laughing at us all over the world, and it's still a complete laughingstock. I think we've maybe moved away from this type of paranoia a little bit. I still think a lot of people have no idea what homophones are and don't realize they don't have anything to do with gay people or gay marriage. But I think that in the last few years, we've seen a bit of a damping down of the paranoia and fear-mongering around gay people. Incredible that it's still even a thing. But yes, I think it has gotten a little bit better. Still a long way to go. You can still be fired for being gay in many states. Apparently, you can still be fired for teaching about gay-sounding homophones in Utah as well, but that's a pretty different story altogether.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
In today's classic interview, we're going back to November of 2009 when Ralph Nader joined us. And the reason I'm going back to this interview is not only because the topic is really interesting, which is Ralph Nader talking about the importance that the super rich, not the rich, but the super rich have to play, the importance of the super rich in helping the economic situation with regard to inequality, wages, and so many other areas. So we're going to go back to that interview because of the topic, but also because there is already a discussion, even though Bernie Sanders, who is running as a Democratic candidate for president, has given no indication at all that he would run as a third-party candidate if he were to fail to secure the Democratic nomination. There is a discussion about that and the potential spoiler effect that that Bernie Sanders rather could have. And thus it's interesting to go back to Ralph Nader, someone that people say had in Florida in the 2000 election that same sort of spoiler impact. So let's go back to November of 2009, classic interview this week with Ralph Nader. On the phone is Ralph Nader, and while he needs no introduction, I'll mention he's the author of Only the Super Rich Can Save Us. Mr. Nader, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, David.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak with you again. Last time we talked, it was about your previous book, The 17 Traditions. And this book, I have to tell you, this one's a lot longer. I don't know if it's 5 or 6 times as long, and I enjoyed it a lot more. And the premise of the book is that 17 billionaires, including Warren Buffett, join forces to save the world. And when you say that, when you say save us, from what exactly do you mean?
Save us from the growing concentration of power in this country in fewer and fewer hands, corporate power taking control of our government, corporate-occupied territory in Washington, D.C., and basically denying the American people the just deserts for their labors, for their rights to universal health insurance, a decent wage, clean politics, even law enforcement against corporate crime, fraud, and abuse, and a move forward on life-sustaining technology, such as renewable energy and other ways of conforming with the natural requirements of the planet Earth. These are long overdue. People, by and large, want this kind of country to evolve in that direction, but there's no money behind these social justice movements compared to the trillions of dollars of industrial and commercial power, Wall Street and others, and their political allies in Washington. So it's a huge mismatch.
When I hear you talk about the concentration of power and wealth the way that you do, I can sense our listeners in our more conservative parts of the country that listen to our show in Missouri, in Idaho, so on and so forth, say, it sounds to me like Ralph Nader is advocating some kind of socialism or communism. But in reading the book, that's not actually what you're talking about, is it?
Not at all. Those are forms of concentration of power as well. And today we have corporate socialism, which is the merger and domination of government with giant business. That's what Franklin Delano Roosevelt warned about in a public message to Congress in 1938, when he said, whenever government is controlled by private economic power, that's fascism. And fascism, communism, all social concentration of power. No, this is, as you see, the dialogue starts in the book in a mountaintop hotel in January 2006 in Maui, Hawaii, where Warren Buffett and others that he's convened, from Bill Cosby to William Gates Sr. to Ted Turner to George Soros and others, he gets them in an atrium room with good Hawaiian fruit and drinks, and they decide they're going to devote a full year with lightning fast strategies, mobilization of people in congressional districts and communities all over the country, and they're going to put whatever it takes. And what it takes, without giving away how it ended in the book, is about $15 billion. And he mobilized tens of millions of people in this country, many of them hungry to take back their country, to put we the people back into the sovereignty of our country, to make Washington accountable to them, and to make big corporations their servants, not their masters. So there is a strong dialogue with conservatives in this book, especially near the end of it, where basically the 17 super rich guys who call themselves meliorists, people who improve things, they knew they couldn't do it by themselves. It had to be a top-down, bottom-up. But they also saw that if they can get common ground on some, not all, some very important economic and freedom and accountability issues between conservatives and liberals, they were much more likely to prevail.
One of the, you mentioned lightning fast strategies, and I think one of the newly always amazing to me things is how slow the current government processes work. I mean, when we talk about healthcare and the proposed healthcare reform, we're talking about changes that will take years to even start rolling out in a phased way. Is there any way that a government as big as the one in the U.S. Could operate in a faster way, could make changes in a quicker way?
That's exactly what this book shows in great detail. Although it's It's political fiction. It's often called practical utopian fiction in the literary world. The rest of it it could happen. I don't want the readers to read a page without saying, this could really happen if the resources, the money, was there. And indeed, that's the signal mark of the book, that it's not just good strategies, it's not just mobilizing working people around the country to take back Congress, etc. It's the funds are there for mass media, for setting up a People's Chamber of Commerce, for small and medium-sized business, for investing in a sub-economy to show best practices in one area, banking and bill collecting and finance and autos and dry cleaning establishments. That's an interesting part of the book, as well as creating a strong citizen Congress watchdog organizations in each congressional district. So what we're talking about here is this. There are 535 men and women in the Senate and House who put their shoes on every day like you and I do. And they have the constitutional power to allocate budgets in an efficient way for a government of, by, and for the people, and to take on these corporations. So that's what we do. We don't, in this book, doesn't exaggerate the opposition and the concentration of power in a few hands. It takes them on, deconstructs them, and slowly you can see the process as it goes through March, April, May, June, July, August, in this titanic power collision. You can see how the concentrated power guys begin to discuss things between themselves that they never would once they see this tidal wave of deliberative popular power moving their direction. And I think it's a book where if people read it, they'll come out feeling stronger as a citizen. There's a lot to learn from strategies and tactics and persistence, and they'll have an exciting read, and they'll be less likely to be inhibited in asking rich people in their community to give money for just causes.
We're talking about Ralph Nader's latest book, Only the Super Rich Can Save Us. You mentioned the 535 members of Congress. Are there any that you would point out specifically as doing the right type of work, focusing on the right issues and in the right way? Are you happy with what any of those 535 members are doing?
Yes. I mean, I would say about 10% of the members of Congress you could enthusiastically vote for.
Like who?
Hardworking. People like Ed Markey, Henry Waxman, Dennis Kucinich, Walter Jones, a Republican from North Carolina, who was very skeptical about the war in Iraq, who thinks that Congress is abandoning its constitutional responsibilities. There are people in the Senate, Senator Feingold, the great champion of the Constitution, for example, are very good. Some of them are very good in certain areas and sort of, not so exciting in other areas. But about 10% of them, they work hard. They really want to try to represent the people. That leaves 90% who are in various degrees of careerism, of surrenderism, of cowardlyism, and of just sheer ignorance, like the ones that are pushing for nuclear power resurgence, nuclear power plants. It's completely uneconomic. It's been shown to be. They won't listen to people like Amory Lovins, the famous energy expert, physicist who consults with utility companies in the Pentagon. They just close out and they say, okay, we're for nuclear power in Congress, and we're going to require the taxpayer to give a 100% loan guarantee to every electric company that builds a new nuclear plant, because the Wall Street private finance firms will not lend money to build these $10 billion plants without a 100% government loan guarantee. That's sheer ignorance.
I want to address healthcare reform a little bit with you.
Yeah.
I'll tell you my view, and then you tell me what you think or if I'm wrong. My view has increasingly been that, number one, Barack Obama took the wrong approach from the start. He should have started out saying, single payer is the way, and I'd be willing to consider, as a compromise, some kind of strong public option, rather than what took place, which is he started out not too strongly for a public option, and now the best case seems to be a very watered-down public option where, by the way, the insurance companies got everything they want in the negotiations.
Yeah, Business Week had a headline a few weeks ago saying the insurance companies are winning.
Well, I always thought that a good compromise is supposed to leave all sides unhappy. I don't see what the insurance companies are giving up in this supposed negotiation.
Or the drug companies.
or the
they're
drug
getting
companies.
a big bonanza and wait and see the prices of medicines.
So what would Barack Obama have been better served to start with single payer, even though I know that it's not anything that I think his communications people would be horrified for him to mention that, and negotiate back to a public option?
Exactly.
I think starting with a public option was the mistake.
Absolutely. They sliced the pie and kept slicing the pie until it's a caricature, the public option that might dribble through, if indeed it gets through the Senate at all. He should have started with what the majority of the American people, doctors and nurses, are for. A simple, full Medicare for all with free choice of doctor and hospital, enormous efficiencies, and the kind that will significantly cut back the per capita expenditure, which is double the size of what Switzerland, Germany, France, and Canada spend on their health care, and they cover everybody, and we don't cover 50 million people. So, yeah, that's what he should have done. First of all, he believes in single payer. He has for years. He said that publicly. He just doesn't think that he can overcome the corporate opposition to it.
A couple of other questions, and these are from listeners that have emailed in over the last week. Number one, does it bother you, and we've spoken about this before a couple of years ago, does it bother you that so many people associate you with having thrown the 2000 election to George W. Bush, eventually leading to what some consider one of the worst political disasters ever, going into Iraq?
Well, no, because it's a false statement. If you ask Al Gore why didn't he go to the White House, he will not mention the Green Party. He will mention that it was stolen from him in Florida in ways that have filled books from Tallahassee to the Supreme Court. He won the popular vote. It's the only democracy I know where you can come in first and lose the office because of something called the Electoral College, and the guy who gets number 2, Bush, becomes president. Third, he knew he should have won his home state of Tennessee and Clinton's home state of Arkansas. Either one would have put him in the White House, even with the shenanigans in Florida. So anybody who just basically says, oh, it was the Green Party, is displaying wittingly or unwittingly a political bigotry, because everyone has a right to run for elective office in this country, and everyone has a right to try to get votes from one another. And the minute we start saying, if you're not a Republican Democrat, you can't do that, then we have a two-party dictatorship, which I refuse to abide by. And my campaign manager has elaborated this in a very exciting new book called The Grand Illusion, The Tyranny of Voter Choice, the myth of voter choice in a two-party tyranny. Her name is Teresa Amato. Very articulate, should be very good on your program.
Excellent.
David.
Lou Franco emailed in, and he said he wants you to react to Malcolm Gladwell's statement that even considering your work for auto safety, that your actions in the 1970s actually delayed the increased use of seatbelts when you said that seatbelt laws wouldn't work, even though now we do know that they increase the amount of seatbelt usage. How would you react to that? Do you regret how that went?
Well, Gladwell doesn't know what he's talking about. He's trying to write about too many things in his books that he doesn't really know much about, sort of a pop psychologist. And I had a long talk with him, and he just refused to listen. We were pushing for both seatbelts and airbags. And if some states like New Hampshire refused to pass mandatory seatbelt usage laws, we thought that it would be good at least to have a federal airbag standard. So we were always double track. My record is very clear, written record, testimony record. But wherever we confronted a very stubborn legislature, for example, and it was at the state level for mandatory usage laws, then we went for airbags or side protection or rollover protection, anything that would minimize the risk of injury should a crash occur.
Mm-hmm. And lastly, you famously said that while there were some differences between Al Gore and George W. Bush in 2000, they were essentially very similar overall in their approach. How would you characterize the similarity or difference between Obama and McCain in 2008?
Well, you see, I judge them heavily on how they react to the corporate domination of our political economy and of our lawmakers and of trying to commercialize anything that moves. Everything's supposed to be for sale in a commercial world. They've commercialized childhood, undermining parental authority and marketing junk food and violent programming to small children and pre-teenagers. And on that yardstick, the two parties aren't that much different. I mean, they both supported the bailout of Wall Street. It was almost a seamless transition from Bush to Obama in terms of all the bailout programs. The re-regulation efforts are very anemic. And sure, I mean, the Democrats are better in some areas of civil rights, to be sure. They're better in some areas of Social Security, for example. But just remember, they're the ones who could have stopped the Patriot Act. They didn't. They're the ones who could have stopped the war in Iraq. They had the votes and the filibuster votes in the Senate. They didn't. They didn't even put up a squawk, hardly. They didn't even say only Congress can declare war, George. We're not going to give it to King George IV to plunge this nation into war. And the other point, David, is what's your sense of urgency and level of expectation? If you have a low level of expectation, then the small differences between the two parties become bigger. But if you have a large, more appropriate level of expectation to have this country at least have some of the social safety nets that Western Europe has had for 50 years, including full health insurance and tuition-free university education, decent public transit, and decent wages and pensions for the bottom third of the workers in Europe is much better than in this country. If you have a higher level of expectation, you can be much more critical of the two parties. We can do better, and we will do better if we have competitive elections. We don't gerrymander districts, so either Republican or Democrats have slam-dunk re-elections, and we allow the voters to have more choice by having third-party and independent candidates. And that's what we're fighting for, to open up the ballot to more agendas and more choices so that people are not confronted with an incumbent who doesn't even have an opposing major party candidate against him and her because they've gerrymandered the districts.
Well, I think you're absolutely right that we can certainly do better, and we've been speaking with Ralph Nader, author of Only the Super Rich Can Save Us, of course, author, political activist, and former presidential candidate. Thanks so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, David, and thank your listeners. I hope they'll have their imagination lifted up by this book, because if we don't lift up our imaginations, we won't have a reach, and if we don't have a reach, we won't have a grasp, and we'll continue the decline of our country, which 81% of the American people in last year's poll believe is the case.
Okay, thanks so much for calling in. We'll talk to you soon.
You're welcome.
Take care. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Let's get into audience questions for this week. Interestingly, two questions that revolve around LGBT baking and employment practices. And as we talked about a week or two ago, it's incredible the significant role that baking is having on politics these days in the United States. First question is from Will. Will says, suppose you ran a bakery and a customer came in and ordered a gay wedding cake bearing the Confederate flag. What would you do? Should you refuse to make the cake because it bears a symbol you find offensive? Would refusing constitute unfair discrimination against the LGBT community? Or would you have to make the cake in some sort of bizarre, non-discriminatory quantum superposition? This is not as complicated as Will and others are making it out to be. The issue is not that you have to make any cake for a gay wedding or a gay couple. The issue is in states where there are non-discrimination statutes that include gender and or sexual orientation as a basis on which business is not allowed to discriminate, you can't discriminate against a group based on their sexual orientation. That's a separate issue from saying we don't do Confederate flag cakes. That's a product that you don't do. The Confederate flag cake could be for a gay wedding, it could be for a straight wedding, it could be for any wedding. It doesn't matter. If you say we don't do Confederate flag cakes, or Nazi cakes or whatever the case may be, that's an item that you wouldn't do for any customer, regardless of whether they are of a particular sexual orientation, gender, religion, race, whatever the case may be. So if your policy is that you don't do stuff with Confederate flag cakes, it doesn't matter that you're refusing a Confederate flag cake to a gay couple. You're not discriminating against the couple on the basis of their being gay. You're simply saying, I don't do Confederate flag cakes, in the same way that many businesses may or may not produce certain items. Period. That is it, Will. I don't know how else I can say this, but that's the reality. It would be no problem whatsoever. Now, if you wanted to make an exception because you said, you know what, I am so supportive of gay marriage, same-sex marriage, the gay community, that I am going to make a Confederate flag cake for them, in spite of the fact that I don't like Confederate flag cakes and wouldn't typically do them because I find them to be symbols of racism and hatred, by all means, you can do that. You are in either case, you are not discriminating against the customers on the basis of their sexual orientation. Next question today is from Jake. Jake's question is also about discrimination when it comes to sexual orientation. Jake wrote to me, we constantly hear about instances where homosexuals are discriminated against at a business under so-called religious freedom laws. The legality of that seems to be quite simple. It's either illegal or it isn't, and usually we find that it ends up being illegal depending on the state. Well, not quite, but let's continue with the question. However, what happens if a business accepts homosexuals into their establishment, but when practicing their services, they purposely do a poor job? If one were able to prove that a business is performing differently based on a person's sexual orientation, doing a good job for heterosexuals while being subpar for members of the LGBT community, what would be the legality of that? If there isn't a law for this, should there be? Or is this even something that can be enforced? I ask these questions knowing that someone who is being forced to cater to the LGBT community would not do so happily. We've got a couple different issues being mixed up here. Religious freedom, non-discrimination, labor practices, etc. So as an umbrella thing, I've spoken many times to employment lawyers about this. It is very, very difficult to prove intent when it comes to the firing of individuals and to prove cause. So you may suspect, for example, that you were fired because of your sexual orientation, for example, but it is really very difficult to prove that, and it can often be costly to do so. So while there may be something that is the letter of the law with regard to employment discrimination or non-discrimination, employers typically can get away with a lot because, as you're sort of alluding to, they can say this person was not fired because of their sexual orientation. This person was fired because of a job performance thing or tardiness or whatever the case may be. Now you're saying something else, which is if you find that an individual who is anti-gay is working at your establishment and they are regularly providing worse service to gay customers that they somehow have determined to be gay, right? And so we have to assume that that's even possible to ascertain from the context of the employment. If they do a worse job for gay customers than for straight customers, then what would be the legality of firing them if their religion is what is causing them to have disdain or to look down upon the gay individuals? This, again, it's written up as a very complex issue, but it really isn't. If we're talking here about discrimination, if they are treating the gay customers differently based specifically on the gay customers being gay, and there is a statute that bans discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, then I believe that it would be okay to fire those individuals because they are in the same way that if they said, you know what, I just don't like black people, and when black people come in, I'm just not going to be very nice to them. You could fire them on either basis, on the fact that they are being discriminatory in a way that violates the state's non-discrimination law if there is one in place, or you could say, regardless of where the line is in terms of when they do a good job or a bad job, some of the time they're not doing a good job here, and thus they are going to be fired. Now, let's get to the second issue, which is, well, if they say the reason they're not treating the gay customers well is because of their religion, it gets very complex. My personal view is that religion should never be an opt-out sort of get out of jail free card, get out of the rules free card in order to violate state law. That's my opinion. There are cases where we look at Hobby Lobby or others where courts have said, actually, religion does provide a sort of exemption to the rules, and it may become an issue for courts to sort of fight out. So my view is, if they are acting in a way that is discriminatory against protected groups of individuals, they should absolutely be fired. Their religion, their arbitrary self-professed religious beliefs should not at all provide them an exemption or opt-out to that. You may disagree. Courts may disagree in certain cases. I don't think that that should be the case. Last question today is from Allison. Allison wrote in, and she said, you recently addressed a question about working to break up a bad relationship of people you know. I have a different but sort of related question. If you're with 3 people who are your friends or people you otherwise respect, and they start criticizing another friend of yours who isn't there, maybe not knowing that they are your friend, do you defend them or do you keep quiet? I don't know that there's a right answer to this. Certainly, if I'm somewhere and some friends of mine start talking negatively about another friend of mine that isn't there, they may know that it's a friend of mine, they may not know. I have sometimes said, hey, you know what? So-and-so isn't really here to defend themselves, and that's my friend, so it's kind of an awkward position. And I don't know that we're really doing the right thing by talking about them behind their back. Sometimes I have said that. In other circumstances, where the combination of factors was such that it led me not to speak out in that way, I just sort of kept quiet. Obviously, I didn't join in on the gossiping and negative talk, but it did make me feel uncomfortable. So I don't know that there is one overarching right answer in every situation. You might say, okay, I'm in a situation where my 2 supervisors are being critical of an acquaintance of mine. I don't really need to cause a bad situation for myself at work to defend someone who is just an acquaintance and I don't even really know the subject matter. In other cases where you're with friends and they're talking negatively about someone who is just as much your friend, I completely would understand and have said myself, hey guys, you know, they're not here to defend themselves. It's a friend of mine. I'm not comfortable with this. So I don't think that there is a right answer here. When we talked about, is it okay to work to break up the relationship of someone you may know, if you've determined that it's a bad relationship for them, the consensus from the audience was, it depends on what's going on. If there is a physical abuse situation, if there is an emotional abuse situation that has gotten really bad, maybe that would be sufficient to say, I'm going to work behind the scenes to end this relationship. If you just don't like the person and you would rather them not be around with your friend, maybe that's not appropriate. That was sort of the consensus from the audience. I'll open it up to you. What do you think about this? In what circumstances would you speak out, if any, if a friend of yours is being criticized in a way that you find is unfair by other people you know? And in what cases would you just kind of shut up and sit there, probably not participating, hopefully not participating, and allow it to go on? We have a fantastic bonus show for you today. davidpakman.com/membership is where you sign up. You can also check out a sample of the bonus show and a lot of the other great member benefits. Speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.